All right, physical science. Let's talk about something called chemical reactions. All right, when we have these elements or compounds that we've just been talking about, they can undergo something called a chemical reaction. A chemical reaction is simply this. When chemical bonds are either produced, made, bonds are constructed, or those bonds are broken. When we have chemical bonds being constructed or broken, we have a chemical reaction. And this means when we have a chemical reaction, we have chemical changes happening, not just physical changes. Most often, a physical change will go along with a chemical change. There will be some sort of chemical change. But with chemical changes, we also have those bonds being made or broken. Physical changes do not make or break chemical bonds. All right, so how do we know when we have a chemical reaction? Well, there's some signs. Now, these are not always 100% perfect, but when you see these things, there's a pretty good chance that a chemical reaction has occurred. First one, the formation of something called a precipitate, and I will abbreviate precipitate with PPT hereafter. What's a precipitate? A precipitate is when you have two solutions, two clear liquids, and you add them together, and all of a sudden a solid gets formed, and that solid falls to the bottom. That's a precipitate. So when we combine two things and we get a precipitate, that's a pretty good sign. That's a really good sign of a chemical reaction. Second good sign of a chemical reaction is the formation of a gas. How do we know that a gas is being formed? Well, sometimes you can see it. You can actually see the vapor rising up out of your test tube or wherever you're doing your chemical reaction. But most often, we have bubbles being formed. We have liquid solutions, and all of a sudden we add two things together, or you might put solids in a liquid, and all of a sudden things start to bubble. Okay, that means a gas is being formed. If you have the formation of a gas, that's a really good sign as well that you have a chemical reaction going on. Some other not as reliable signs, but still pretty good signs. If you have an odor change, all of a sudden you smell something weird, usually that means there's some sort of gas being formed, so that goes back to number 2. A temperature change, okay? If your container that you're mixing two things in gets really cold, that's a good sign that there's a chemical reaction. Or if it gets really hot, that's a good sign that there's a chemical reaction. And the last one is a color change, when we have the difference of color. All right, there are several types of chemical reactions.